From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Thursday, December 5. Aboriginal leader Noel Pearson says every child should be taught using old-fashioned methods proven to work. It comes after NAPLAN results surged in schools where direct instruction, also known as explicit teaching, was embraced. Economic growth has hit the skids, its lowest rate in history, after 7 consecutive quarters where we've all felt the pinch. Now the government is spending through the roof in the bid to avoid a recession. Those stories are live right now at theaustralian.com.au. The NRL is getting a new team and it'll be funded by Australian taxpayers. The addition of a Papua New Guinean footy team is part of the government's diplomatic endeavours in the Pacific. But is it enough to curb China's influence? That's today's story. In Papua New Guinea, where tribal tensions run hot and occasionally turn into machete-powered bloodshed, there's one thing everybody agrees on.
Where's the support? Kicks again. Moria coming through. Oh, what a try!
Rugby league is the best.
In front of the sticks from dummy half, tried to buzz his way over. As he got that ball down, that's a big question mark. And I think this is going to be a try. Celebration has started. Referee says it's try.
There's an annual festival of the boot, the PNG Prime Minister's 13 versus an Australian PM side. That's a bit like the Melbourne Cup in Australia, compulsory viewing.
You really haven't seen anything until you've seen PNG during a State of Origin game. The whole place is just glued to their TV screens.
Most locals support Queensland and the Maroons, but there are enough Blues fans to keep things interesting.
It can actually get quite hairy after the games, and violence and riots and that type of thing can break out. They really do give Australian fans a run for their money.
Papua New Guinea has a side in the Queensland Rugby League comp. It's famous for fast, aggressive footy. But for nearly 2 decades, PNG's governments have been campaigning for the country to have its own team in the National Rugby League. Now it's happening, and it's Australian taxpayers footing the bill. Ben Packham is the Australian's Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent. He's usually on the front talking about matters of state. And it turns out this is a matter of state.
The government's supporting this bid for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it wants to bring the nations closer together through sport. PNG is rugby league mad, and this is something that Australia can do for PNG that no other country can do. Now, under the surface, there's also another important reason, and that is China. The Australian government is, as Penny Wong has said, in a constant state of competition with China across the Pacific. And we really need to make sure that China does not increase its influence and its footprint in Pacific nations, but particularly in Papua New Guinea, which is our closest neighbour.
China is unashamedly seeking influence in the Pacific and is already a major trading partner of most of Australia's closest neighbours, as well as the biggest customer for minerals and commodities from timber to fish. China's next goal is to forge security, military and policing arrangements across the region. And in Papua New Guinea's Prime Minister James Marape, they found a leader who says he's willing to talk to any nation that'll help his people. Marape doesn't want aid handouts. He wants development that'll make Papua New Guinea, as he says, the world's richest black Christian nation.
When it comes to the electricity network of our closest neighbour, Australia has been left in the dark.
Papua New Guinea has revealed it had secret early talks with China on security and policing.
That's sent Australia scrambling to be at the table.
Australia promising $200 million to help bolster PNG's judiciary and massively scale up its police force, which is grappling with escalating tribal violence.
Prime Minister Albanese on the Kokoda track alongside the PNG Prime Minister.
We are the security partner of choice for Papua New Guinea. We're family.
I am very deeply honoured to be accorded this rare privilege being the first Prime Minister of my country to address the Australian Parliament.
The negotiations for this agreement have been going for many months, and Australia has been working with PNG on the nuts and bolts of how it will all work, as well as the NRL, on the financials of how this team will be able to sustain itself, on grassroots game development and so forth. But the Australian government has also suggested that there is a security element to this agreement. Now, we've seen the government do some interesting deals around the region, particularly with Tuvalu. The government's Whale Union agreement with Tuvalu offers permanent visas and migration pathway for Tuvaluans in return for a veto over Tuvalu's future security agreements. And so basically it sidelines China. Now, the Australian government's also working on a similar agreement with Nauru, which it hopes to finalise in coming weeks. The PNG NRL deal is another opportunity to put Australia's interests front and centre in the Pacific, and the Australian government has intimated that, yes, there are security aspects to this agreement. But PNG's Foreign Minister Mr Tkatchenko has told The Australian that, in fact, Australia did not insist on a security guarantee in the final agreement that has been struck here. He says that, yes, this was discussed at the highest levels, but ultimately it's totally irrelevant to what they're trying to achieve, and they want to keep geopolitics out of this. Now, Australia does have a bilateral security agreement with Papua New Guinea, which does include a commitment to consult on any other security tie-ups that it might wish to do. But in terms of this NRL deal, according to the PNG Foreign Minister, there is no explicit security right of veto for Australia.
It's a really interesting choice, isn't it, Ben? Presumably Australia could have chosen to come in quite hard to these negotiations and say, look, we will give you this thing that we know your people want, an NRL team, but there's a price to pay and this is it. If Australia has chosen not to take that path and is going about it a little bit more softly, what do you think that would say about Australia's choices?
Well, they do call this sort of stuff soft diplomacy, so a more measured approach is probably warranted. Pat Conroy, Australia's Minister for the Pacific, has done a great job here in bringing things to where we are, to the point that this agreement is going to be signed. The NRL has also been central to this in coming to the party. All will be revealed next week in terms of the agreement, but as far as we know at this stage, and according to Papua New Guinea, there are no explicit guarantees around security.
Coming up, the gritty details of just how a taxpayer-funded footy team will work. Rugby league can be pretty wild.
Cameron Munster will go to rehab tomorrow, facing $130,000.
I want all kids out there to know that my behaviour was not okay.
Well, this is absolutely the last thing the NRL needed, sex scandal.
NRL player Latrell Mitchell has been issued with a breach notice days after a photo leaked online.
Dancing on a hotel room coffee table, flashing a small Ziploc bag full of white powder.
Ben, we know from the amount of time NRL stars spend in the news that managing an NRL team is incredibly difficult. How is it going to work in practice?
There's been quite a bit of progress on the sort of nuts and bolts of the issue. And just last week, PNG announced in its budget that players for this new franchise will have tax-free status for the next decade. So that will assist in attracting Australian and other international players to the team. And, Port Moresby isn't the safest place, I think, is probably putting it mildly. They do have some domestic security issues, and there will be a secure apartment complex built for the players and their family members so that they can live in the PNG capital without sort of fear of being the victims of crime or violence that sadly are all too common in the country.
Since China began flexing its muscle in the Pacific and actively courting our direct neighbours, Australia's done a number of things to try to develop a good feeling, really, among the people of the Pacific about Australia. One of those is the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, where workers come from the islands to work in Australia and are able to send remittances back to their families, often being able to make a huge amount of money that they wouldn't make in a lifetime at home from a few years of work here in Australia. What do you think about those people-to-people kind of links, Ben? It seems like the government's really kind of doubled down on that as its big idea. Do you think it's the right idea?
I think it's very important. These sorts of things are very important. The Pacific Area Labour Mobility Scheme has been very successful in building those ties between Australia and Pacific countries. The government's also looking at potentially recruiting Pacific people into the Australian Defence Force. That's not quite there yet, but that would also serve to bring Australia closer to its Pacific neighbours. These are all sorts of things which China's not in a position to do. They really underscore the historic ties that Australia has with the region. We share history, we share a common language, we enjoy the same sports, and leveraging off those sorts of common interests and common values is really a no-brainer when it comes to diplomacy.
Ben Packham is the Australian's Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent. You can read his exclusive interview with PNG's Foreign Minister right now at theaustralian.com.au.